organizations that is growing steadily as we move through different actions for data responsibility in the sector. And we're welcoming anyone who's interested in connecting with this group to reach out to us and inquire more about membership in the DRWG if you're interested in what we share with you today. Next slide. Much of the work in data responsibility in humanitarian action has been around developing best practice together. And so the goal of our group really has been to coordinate how we think about these different tactics for the safe, ethical, and effective management of data. And we encourage you to share your own best practice with us following the instructions on this slide, and we can also share a link in the chat. Next slide. So when we talk about data responsibility in humanitarian settings, we're often now referring to a set of key actions that are articulated in something called the IASC Operational Guidance on Data Responsibility. The IASC stands for the Interagency Standing Committee, and it's the highest coordination body in the humanitarian sector. Next slide. Roughly 3 years ago, the organizations on this panel and a broader group of partners embarked on a process to develop the first ever operational guidance on data responsibility. This document was endorsed in February of 2021 and subsequently revised over the past year, and actually is about to be published later this week so that we can circulate that with people who are interested in learning more. Next slide, please. I still see the cover slide. And this operational guidance provides a foundation for how we think about data responsibility in different operational settings. Much of the focus of the discussion today will be on hearing from the different panelists' experience implementing actions for data responsibility as articulated in this guidance. And as a reference moving forward, this serves as the core framework for data responsibility in the sector. Just checking quickly if the panelists see the slide that says the title of the guidance, or if you actually, yeah. Sorry, can we just try to advance the slides? And otherwise it's not a problem, but we could maybe stop broadcasting them.
They should be able to see that. And if you look at the...
perfect. Now we can see, yep,
yeah.
Perfect. And one more, just to the next slide. So just to make sure that we have conceptual clarity, we wanted to share this visual of how we think about data responsibility within humanitarian action as it relates to humanitarian principles, data protection, and data security. When we talk about data responsibility, we're talking about the safe, ethical, and effective management of both personal and non-personal data. This encompasses, but is larger than, the concepts of data protection and data security, which also interact or interrelate, but are also distinct in different ways. Underpinning everything we do with data in humanitarian action, including the framework that we're talking about today, are the humanitarian principles. And this really serves as the foundation for how we think about upholding the rights of people affected by crisis as we manage their data to serve them and protect them. Next slide. In the operational guidance, you will see very practical components around sort of how the guidance can be used, a common set of principles that have now been endorsed by agencies across the system, and a set of actions for different levels in humanitarian action, what we refer to as the system-wide level, the cluster or sector level, which is sort of thematic coordination structures in a given response, and then the organization level. Much of the discussion today will focus on tactics for different organizations looking to implement this guidance in their own work, as well as strategies to collaborate together to foster more collective approaches for data responsibility, as the title of this event suggests. We can stop sharing the slides then. We'll, of course, be sure to share the link to that guidance in the chat so that colleagues can access it. But we just wanted to share that backdrop so you have a sense of who we are, the group that we are a part of around moving this guidance forward, and then the framework that we'll be focusing on for the rest of this talk. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce the panelists and then dive right into the discussion. I'm not sure necessarily which order you'll see them on your screen. But I'll introduce them as I have them listed here, and then hopefully you're able to see their faces as we go through. So Rachel Cloutier is a Senior Data Policy Officer with UNHCR. Naina Das is the Head of Research with Impact Initiatives. Nafi Pouillet is a data scientist with the OCHA Center for Humanitarian Data. Catherine Starup is the head of the Global Protection Unit at the Danish Refugee Council, and Rob Trigwell is a Senior DTM Coordination Officer at IOM, the International Organization for Migration. In the first round of questions, I'll ask a few panelists to share what we've learned over the past few years since the operational guidance that I've just shared with you was first endorsed back in February of 2021. And Katrine, for this, I'd like to start with you. Could you share with the group, based on DRC's experience, some of the major barriers to adoption of data responsibility at the organizational level?
Yeah, thank you, Stuart. And very happy to be here today, and happy to see all the colleagues joining here online. In terms of the barriers or the challenges, this needs to come with a note that this is not for the lack of commitment exactly to responsible data management and data responsibility in terms of the safe and ethical and effective management of data. I want to share 3 elements of challenges or barriers that we are experiencing at the organizational level. One is around, and it may seem a little strange, but I'll explain. One is around the focus, the needed focus on personal data protection. As an operational NGO, that is DRC, Danish Refugee Council, based in the EU, we naturally and rightly so have a huge focus on personal data protection, and with that also the GDPR. That focus comes with quite a focus and emphasis on risks in terms of data management, which is needed, but maybe at the expense of also making sure that we do indeed identify and solicit the benefits of working with data, making the most of the data, and sharing the data with other parties and sharing amongst ourselves. So that heavy focus that we continue to have and all these efforts to systematize and build capacity around responsibly handling personal data sometimes takes away a little the emphasis and the needed focus also on non-personal data. So that's one of the challenges we have experienced. And for that, here the operational guidance has that really important focus on both guiding and providing guidance on personal and non-personal data. So that was the first element. Secondly, we have seen and we continue to work to build joint shared approaches to assess, identify data sensitivities, and again, not only of personal data, but also importantly of non-personal data, because we know that not only personal data carries with it sensitivities, but indeed also non-personal data in humanitarian context and crisis context. So again, the challenge in terms of continuing to build that capacity in our organizations amongst each other of having that ability and that capacity to really identify these data sensitivities, and with that also enabling us to make much better use of the data and to be able to use and share it in a responsible manner. Lastly, the recurrent challenge is indeed about data sharing, both within our organization, but I would argue much more amongst organizations. So at the organization, sharing the data, making sure that we are capable of identifying again the data sensitivities to be able to manage the data and share it in a responsible manner. This is by far the biggest challenge that we have in terms of responsibly working and managing data. That is how we make sure that we can share and identify the sensitivities of low sensitivities for data, enabling us to share much more and make much better use of it, but also to manage the sensitivities of also personal data in a way which makes it shareable in a responsible manner. Again, the operational guidance, and we'll talk much more about it in this session, has really provided some core shared principles and actions that enable us to move forward with the sharing and the identification of sensitivities and how we can best manage that. I'll leave it here. Thanks, Stuart.
Thank you so much, Katrine. I think that's a really great starting point for this conversation, because while we've made a lot of progress as a sector on this issue over the last few years, there are still a number of persistent challenges, including those that you highlighted. But at the same time, and that was clear in your description, all of these challenges are things that have actually been areas where we've learned a lot together over the past several years, and also developed different tactics to address the issues you've highlighted. So I think we're able to see through practice how to address some of these barriers. At the same time, we've learned quite a lot about what makes this work and what enables data responsibility in different operational settings. So I'd like to go next to Rochelle and ask you to share from UNHCR's perspective and experience what some of the more positive enablers are of data responsibility in humanitarian action.
Great. Thanks, Stuart, and good morning, good afternoon again. The organizational level is really important, since as organizations learn and integrate data responsibility into their own policies and practices, they're better able to come to the table of the cluster sector level and the system-wide level and lead by example. Of course, that's not always easy, as Katrine has just noted. That said, there are a few things that come to mind in terms of enablers. A first approach is to adopt a mainstreaming approach to data responsibility, just like we do for protection. There are two main avenues for that. The first is to mainstream data responsibility into policies and other types of guidance. Although an organization may not be ready to develop something as formal and as binding as a data responsibility policy, there are many ways to integrate data responsibility into other guidance work, so it's part of the overarching normative framework of an organization. For example, UNHCR has about half a dozen guidance pieces that now reference data responsibility principles as the broad ethical guidance for what we do. The second is mainstreaming data responsibility into trainings and other capacity development activities. A dedicated module on or learning program on data responsibility would be ideal, but even if that's not possible, we can do things like integrating data responsibility examples into other trainings. So, for example, a training on needs assessments can include examples of how data responsibility principles are implemented in practice in that activity, or how the ecosystem mapping is linked up to needs assessment registries. So with such a mainstreaming approach, we can come to hope that all colleagues, regardless of their functions, are more aware of data responsibility, and that it's not something that the data people talk about in a little dark corner at the back of the room. The second enabler I wanted to mention is crisis. We saw that the Ukraine war was a shock to Europe, and there was a huge mobilization around the humanitarian response. This creates an opportunity to do things differently. So the data and information sensitivity classification that OCHA developed for Ukraine for the internal IDP response really raised awareness about this key data responsibility action, not just for the response in Ukraine, but where it was meant to be used, but also for the refugee response in neighboring countries. So when data responsibility actions are brought in from the outset of an emergency, we can use that as an anchor or a springboard to push forward additional data responsibility actions. So those are some ideas about enablers we've seen, and it leads me to say two quick things about macro level enablers that really make all of this possible. The first one is senior management support. In my work in the field and working with field colleagues now, a constant message has been data responsibility cannot happen without senior management understanding and support. Indeed, they're the ones who decide about the vision, the program, and the resources. So communication and capacity development and advocacy with senior managers is key for them to be enablers and champions of this work. The second macro level enabler is data culture. A lot of this requires some level of comfort with data and data related issues. Right now, I think that many colleagues feel that data is a technical thing for the colleagues who have data in their title. But I think as organizations grow in their data culture and capacity, I would hope that data responsibility actions, the opportunities for these really increase and are actually taken up as a normal part of how we work. So those are some reflections on enablers. Back to you, Stuart.
Thanks so much, Rochelle. That's really rich, and I think gives members of the audience a good sense of the complexity of this issue, but also the varied strategies that different organizations are developing to move forward on responsible data management. I want to stay in this vein a little bit and move to Rob to ask with perhaps a slightly more operational focus. So less at the global level, but really in a given humanitarian setting. What are some additional ways that organizations can advance data responsibility in their own work?
Yeah, thanks, Stuart, and thanks for colleagues online. To echo quite a similar message to Rochelle from UNHCR, is that kind of IOM treat kind of data as a cross-cutting themes across program areas. Speaking from experience over the past 24 months, is that also, but however, data responsibility is kind of a new term and often misunderstood with kind of data protection and data security. So I think the value of the diagram you presented earlier, that is also in the new guidance, is actually really key to kind of demonstrate that those are two important yet distinct kind of components that fit into like a more broader topic that is data responsibility. Because within IOM, we have our data security would be essentially our ICT team, data protection would be our legal team, and then we have our operations team. So kind of that all-encompassing diagram is that they need to be fully integrated into the response. So how IOM, speaking from our experience, how we've kind of promoted it, we've kind of, I would recommend maybe two different approaches. So we in operations, whether it's camp management or shelter or cash programs, data is an integral part of that process. So I specifically work for the data team, but very similar to what Rochelle was saying, is that this is not a topic that you know, data is not an external segment to that. It's fully integrated to the response. So one of the best ways to really promote data responsibility is essentially ingraining it into operations itself, not treating it as an add-on, but really just like how monitoring and evaluation is an integral part of any programming, data responsibility needs to be treated as the same. Now, so one of the ways to really do that is to basically, rather speaking data people to data people, is data people to program operations people. And for example, so we've done a number of kind of awareness raising training sessions, say to our camp management colleagues at our annual retreats with all their operations to raise awareness. IOM is a cluster lead agency on this, and obviously we have a complete kind of chapter in the guidance about kind of cluster wide kind of data responsibility. So that's really speaking, transposing the topic of data responsibility to the operational actors is one way to really kind of push this at field level. IOM also has its displacement tracking matrix team, which is the team I'm part of, which is collecting, handling, sharing information on the ground to inform responses. We have a number of kind of standards of how a DTM operation should and does run, as standards, and continuously kind of putting data responsibility at different areas within the 15 standards, referencing the guidance, referencing the principles, and using the tools when we don't have our own. Is one of that it's been quite an effective way to kind of integrated it into existing program areas. And then also one area we've seen really raise some appetite internally in the last 6 months is around AAP, and how AAP have really adopted DR as a skill set or a component of their work. To demonstrate that, last week at the Humanitarian Network Partnerships Week in the hybrid, AAP colleagues led a session, and there was to the AAP community, so who would traditionally be different to, say, the information management and assessment analysis community, with 300 participants, specifically about how data responsibility can be a component of AAP. So really kind of echoing that, like, people kind of take ownership of it. So these are more of the informal ways to kind of promote DR within people's work. And then secondly, there's the institutional approach, very similar to kind of what Rochelle was saying, that a lot of organizations, IOM and maybe colleagues online, is that agencies will have their own data protection guidelines. They'll have their own data security guidelines. But because DR, data responsibility, is a relatively new term, IOM, for example, doesn't have it. So doesn't have a IOM particular data responsibility guidelines. So in the absence of that, we have got the organization to kind of institutionally buy into the IASC version, sending out staff advisories. So in the absence, you could argue maybe there is no need for one because there is an IASC framework on this. So, but really getting the organization from the executive office to the senior management to say this is the framework on data responsibility that we adhere to has really helped give reference points when we're speaking about topics that fall outside data protection or fall outside data security, the value of data impact assessments and so on. So yeah, these are kind of two ways. There's the informal ways through integration into existing programs, and then really the institutional buy-in and kind of the institutional reference points on data responsibility from IOM. And yeah, thank you. And I'll pass it back over to you, Stuart.
Thanks so much, Rob. I think that's a really good reminder that it's not necessarily a matter of having a formal policy structure. And as each of the initial speakers has sort of alluded to, different organizations have quite distinct approaches to this work. The important thing to keep in mind is that regardless of your institutional policy or guidance frameworks in place, this common guidance can serve as a reference and then have sort of different paths to implementation depending on what's most relevant to your organization in its work with data. In the next set of interventions, we're going to learn a bit more about how the guidance actually is put into practice by different organizations. And I hope this will give the audience a better sense of how this might be relevant to your own work, even if this is the first time you're hearing the term data responsibility, or if your institution does not yet have a framework or related guidance for this type of data management. So for this, Nina, I'd like to come next to you. And from your perspective as the head of research at Impact, but also the various roles you had over the years being directly involved in data management in different forms, how has this operational guidance actually translated into practice for your institution?
Thanks, Stuart. So yeah, for those that are not familiar a bit with the work that we do as Impact, we're primarily a research and analysis organization in humanitarian context. So these guidelines have been a kind of holy grail to develop our own sets of tools and processes. And we think about that in three kind of key stages, practically speaking. So first is the actual data production process itself. So how can we responsibly collect data from crisis-affected communities? Then the actual management of that data during the analysis and all the internal work that we do with all the data we collect, and obviously the dissemination and sharing, all of which is kind of part of the work we do on a day-to-day basis. Now, if I take a concrete example of the type of work we do a lot in a lot of contexts. Last year, for example, in a 20+ context, we facilitated joint needs assessments together with OCHA and the wider humanitarian community. These are very large-scale kind of collaborative exercises involving primary data collection, which are intended to eventually inform annual humanitarian planning processes. So what this means in terms of kind of mainstreaming data responsibility, as Rachel was saying before, is from the very beginning, designing for how this is going to be kind of produced and used together with kind of the key data responsibility principles in mind. So first and foremost, kind of deciding together as a community, all stakeholders involved in the process, what is the kind of key information needs that we actually need to address, responsibly collect that data in as relevant and light process as possible, as much as possible. It's not always possible. And of course, sometimes it means that there are very diverse information needs you have to address. So a health actor and an education actor might need more kind of sensitive personal data compared to maybe food security, for example, in which case we also have to kind of establish these risk assessments from the very beginning and identify, okay, what type of data we are collecting, which one comes with specific risks and why, and ultimately, how can we kind of manage this data to make sure bilateral data sharing agreements are set up for those that are needed, but we can still remove this data without kind of jeopardizing too much the information value of this data set. So from the very beginning, through platforms like joint assessment analysis working groups, kind of having these conversations in place, doing a lot of kind of data sensitivity and risk assessments to make sure everyone's on the same page, and then eventually setting up bilateral data sharing agreements as much as necessary. Having said that, once that immediate kind of milestone is reached, right, these assessments produce really large, comprehensive data sets that can be responsibly used for a lot of other purposes as well. And I think part of data responsibility is also making sure we maximize utility of the data that we are collecting from crisis-affected communities. And in order to do that, then it's a question of dissemination and responsible data sharing. And this is where we've worked quite a bit with the HDX colleagues at the Center for Humanitarian Data to define a bit how can we make sure we can make this data as widely accessible as possible for users beyond what it was initially intended for, while still retaining the kind of information value without kind of removing everything that is considered sensitive, but then at the same time making sure whatever is needed for meaningful analysis is still available. And I think Nafi will be speaking a bit about this last point after me. So I think I'll stop there, but I'm curious to hear what questions come.
Brilliant, Naina. Thanks so much. I think that really helps ground humanitarian data management and some of the really practical aspects of how we collect and use data. And as you mentioned, we'll turn next to Nafi to hear about sort of the other end of that process or sort of sequence of activities to understand how data is responsibly shared on the platform that the Center for Humanitarian Data manages, the Humanitarian Data Exchange, including some of the practices that Nafi and her colleagues have embedded into their own work to make sure that the guidance translates into this aspect of humanitarian data management as well. So Nafi, over to you.
Thank you, Stuart. Good afternoon, everyone. So one of the areas of focus for the UNHCR Center for Humanitarian Data is data services. That work stream includes direct management of the Humanitarian Data Exchange, HDX, which is the OCHA open platform for partners to find and share data across multiple crises. The goal of HDX is to make humanitarian data easy to find and use for analysis. Since its launch in 2014, HDX has become the go-to place for humanitarian data. The platform brings together thousands of datasets from hundreds of organizations. So the HDX team performs quality assurance on every dataset uploaded to the platform. This quality assurance process includes a data sensitivity check in which we carefully review every dataset to ensure that it does not contain personal data or other sensitive information that is prohibited on HDX according to our terms of service. We define sensitive data as any dataset that may contain personally identifiable information of affected populations or aid workers. This includes demographically identifiable information, DII, or identifiable community information, CII, that could potentially put individuals or communities at risk. We also consider individual survey data known as microdatasets as potentially sensitive. Indeed, microdatasets can lead to the re-identification of individuals even when direct identifiers such as names and phone numbers are removed. Therefore, we work closely with data contributors such as RICH, as Nayana mentioned, to apply statistical disclosure control, SDC, which is a technique to assess and mitigate the risk of re-identifying individuals or organizations when analyzing microdatasets. The HDX data sensitivity process is based on the IASC Operational Guidance and consists of 3 steps. The first step is to determine the level of sensitivity for a potential sensitive dataset flagged by our quality assurance team. If the dataset is identified as a microdataset, we use SDC Micro, a statistical disclosure control tool developed by the World Bank and partners to assess the probabilities that successful disclosure for individuals' respondents occurs. During the review process, we ensure that the potentially sensitive dataset is not available for download on the HDX platform to prevent any unauthorized access. If the sensitivity is confirmed, in the second step, we provide recommendations to the contributor for the dataset to be made public on HDX. For microdatasets with a high probability of successful disclosure, we support contributors in running the data through the actual SDC process which reduces the risk of re-identification by applying one or more anonymizing methods using the SDC micro tool. And the final step is to measure the information loss resulting from the dataset treatment. This involves comparing the information value of the original dataset with the final information value, and for microdatasets, reassessing the risk of re-identification ensures that it has been sufficiently reduced before making the dataset publicly available again. For sharing rich multi-sector needs assessment dataset MSNAs on HDX, we follow the Joint Guidance notes that provide specific guidelines for rich teams regarding the recommended approaches for the publication of rich data on HDX. By following this data sensitivity process, we can effectively safeguard the privacy and security of individuals while making the data accessible to the humanitarian community. And so using the IASC Operational Guidance helps us strike a balance between these two objectives, which ultimately enables evidence-based decision-making and improves the lives of those affected by crisis. Back to you, Stuart.
Thank you so much, Nafie. I think your intervention coupled with Nina's gives people a pretty holistic sense of the different considerations around a data management process, and also how the operational guidance concretely informs actions to improve the safe, ethical, and effective management of data in humanitarian response. So that's really helpful. We've got about 25 minutes left in this session, so I just want to remind colleagues online, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them into the chat because we'll get to the Q&A in about 10 minutes. And again, colleagues in the room, we'll rely on the room moderator in case anyone is there with questions. So the final quicker round of questions is really to look at what we can do more as a system, sort of collectively and collaboratively, building on all of the great lessons learned and then tactics that we've already heard about in the individual organizational level. And for this, I'll do a quick tour with the DRWG co-chairs to hear one tactic that you think we as a system can sort of jointly use to accelerate adoption of data responsibility. Let me go first to Rochelle. So from your perspective, Rochelle, what's one tactic to accelerate adoption of data responsibility in practice?
Thanks, Stuart. I think implementation is as important as it is challenging. There's a lot of legacy and path dependency in terms of how we do things and the kind of reflexes that our colleagues have when they arrive in an operational context. That said, one tactic or strategy that can be used is to invest in capacity development, and to do so from an external facing perspective. And by this, I mean two things. On the one hand, external facing means making learning materials about data responsibility available on public platforms. This sharing highlights their value as a public good and helps raise awareness and capacity beyond an organization's own staff. As is often the case, it's our ability to do data responsibility depends on the capacity of others. It can be hard to do data responsibility alone. Last year, for example, the DRWG training task team did a mapping of its members' publicly available learning materials. And we saw that although some materials need to stay internal because they're specific to an organization's policies, many are publicly available. And I think that's quite important and useful. On the other hand, external facing capacity development means collaborating with others to develop these materials in the first place. This is not only effective in terms of pooling resources and expertise, but it can also improve the quality of these materials, as the content and the examples speak to different organizational mandates and a broader range of response contexts. So the resulting learning materials are more relevant, more practical, and speak to a broader audience, and hopefully will then be more effective in catalyzing the actions we want to see in the data responsibility space and changing behaviors. How do we get there? I think groups like the DRWG can be really impactful in this sense. OCHA has been really great in this regard, as they have a data literacy expert who's been advising the working group on these questions around data literacy and capacity building. So if we leverage these existing materials, align them to the IASC Operational Guidance, and share them on public platforms, both the data-specific platforms, but also the platforms of others. So we, make sure to expand this conversation beyond the data people. I think we can have a really good impact to support the adoption of data responsibility. Over to you, Stuart.
Thank you, and I'll go next. Stuart is having connectivity problems. Thanks a lot, Rachel. And my one tactic or strategy is somewhat linked. At a high level, my tactic will be that we need to continue to invest in changing the mindset to away from quite a heavy focus on risks associated with data management and responsible data management, to have that good balance between identifying, mitigating the risks, but also equally importantly, addressing and optimizing the benefits, maximizing the benefits of our whole management in a responsible way of data. Specifically, my one tactic would be to invest more, as I talked about earlier, invest more in having a shared approach and building capacity for data sensitivity assessments, not only internally at organizational level, but certainly also amongst ourselves as humanitarian actors responding in humanitarian action. So that whole data capacity for data sensitivity and assessing data sensitivity is so incredible important, and it serves the dual purpose of both jointly assessing the risks and facilitating that important discussion about how we mitigate the risks. And that will give us a joint understanding also of what the risks are. And the second element of that will be that we will be able to much further challenge ourselves in terms of ensuring that we are indeed exploring, identifying the benefits and the opportunities, and finding jointly ways of sharing and making much better use and more use of the data that we manage within our organizations and amongst ourselves as humanitarian actors in the system. So that whole investment in data sensitivity assessment capacity, if you like, will enable us to do more effective data management. It will solicit the opportunities for data sharing, data use for quality humanitarian outcomes. I'll hand over to you, Rob, for the last tactic.
Thank you, Catalin. So I asked one of my senior management people yesterday their thoughts on this, and we come up with a nice term, or I think it was a existing term, that kind of like everyone needs to feel uncomfortable. And what I mean by that is that really is the ownership over this. It's not the traditional information management working group colleagues on data. It's really everyone involved within the humanitarian operational response is involved in this to some extent. And I think, but to kind of echo to lean towards what Catalin was saying, also a positive note on it as well. So, data responsibility to kind of leverage the potential of data. So to really kind of communicating, leveraging the tools that exist that have been developed over the last couple of years, that with the different iteration of the guidance, is understanding kind of how data responsibility can essentially improve everyone's work. We work in a kind of more of a data-driven kind of community than ever, you could argue. So you could argue that the kind of more robust data sharing agreements, more up-to-date kind of data management kind of registries and so on, is just all in all kind of like create that enable environment for better analysis, for better innovations, but in a safer way. So kind of by everyone adopting this kind of responsible mindset, then argue it could improve the analysis, the evidence-based approach to our program that they're all trying to achieve. So that everyone needs to feel uncomfortable kind of quote sounds a bit negative, but what we're more trying to say is that kind of like it's a collective effort, and it having this forum here with a lot of the kind of within the humanitarian response, a lot of the kind of data collection agencies or the collators or the analysis, having the OCHAs, the reaches, the HERs of the sector, kind of who lead a lot of the analysis and collection in this space, but also talking so proactively about data responsibility as well, is a way to kind of communicate and advocate that, having people involved in data collection, but also speaking just as much about kind of data collection as about how to responsible with the data, is a really a way to kind of push that kind of that positive note on responsibility. It's not a blocker to innovation or analysis. It's more of a leverage point, and kind of having an attitude, and how data sharing agreements, for example, it can facilitate better analysis and better kind of decision making, not block it. So it's I don't know. Yeah, that would kind of be my my take on kind of how we as a sector can kind of push forward in this space. And I'll hand back over to Stuart, and if not, maybe perhaps Jos.
I think you should be able to hear me now, and
we do.
Perhaps even see me. Good. Sorry for the connectivity mishap. So I think that set of tactics gives us a sense of a few of the key areas for investment that are really a priority. Capacity is clearly one. Clarification of how this relates to different parts of work. As one of the panelists mentioned earlier, data is really integrated increasingly into everything that we do. And so being really clear on our sort of different roles and responsibilities to put this work into practice is essential. It's not just people who work day to day with data, but really anyone involved in designing and delivering humanitarian assistance and protection will in some way or another be involved with managing data. So we need to keep that in mind. And then some of the more specific areas for capacity development that the panelists mentioned, I think really resonate both in terms of what we see at the global level in terms of the discussion from the Data Responsibility Working Group partners, but also what we observe from the center's perspective, both on the level of data shared within HDX and our own support to OCHA offices in different environments. I don't see any questions in the chat yet, so I will take the liberty of asking Naina and Nafi an additional question, and then again would encourage any members of the audience to come in. And actually, apologies, I see that Clarissa has just dropped a question in, so thank you very much, Clarissa. Naina and Nafi, I'll come to you in a minute. But Clarissa is asking, how are organizations tackling the challenge of implementation of data responsibility practice when sharing data with third parties, and perhaps with a particular focus on governments and the private sector? So I will ask quickly if any of the panelists want to jump in and answer that, and otherwise I will just assign somebody. Does anyone want to at least start with responding to that question?
I can get us started.
Great, thanks, Rochelle.
Thank you for the question. It's so key for a number of reasons. The first one being thinking to large data sharing. The question of how do we engage with governments is ever more present as, for example, governments become more willing and able to manage their own registration processes. And here I'm thinking about refugee response and the registration of refugees. That, of course, begs the question, how do we responsibly do that? And so there's two approaches. The first one is that if the sharing of data is a personal data, and the transfer is large, which would be the case in most refugee response scenarios, we have to do, per our policies, a data protection impact assessment. And these DPIAs is a mechanism to assess the risks and the benefits of the sharing, and how it can be done in compliance with data protection policies and principles, including from the perspective of data subject rights. And so that DPIA will generate findings and recommendations that will then guide the decision to share, if and how and when, the data with the government. For non-personal data sharing, this is a space where I think we still need to grow and mature. We do have some information sharing protocols, for example, where that can regulate or frame or put some guide rails around the sharing of non-personal data, knowing that that data can also be sensitive, in which case more classic benefit risk assessment would be conducted along the lines of what Katrine was evoking earlier, where we look at the benefits and the risks in terms of the protection and well-being and rights of persons of concern, of the affected communities and the people that we serve, as well as organization staff, and also the kind of softer considerations like organizational reputation, which allows us to deliver the mandate and support affected communities. So I hope those are some helpful components, but indeed a very good and important question.
Thanks so much, Rochelle. And absolutely, this is a dynamic. I wouldn't say it's necessarily a challenge, but it's a dynamic we're increasingly navigating in most operational settings, sort of figuring out, given that there is now a broader and more diverse group of actors involved in humanitarian action, how to make sure that we all have clarity on what responsible data management looks like, what data can and should be shared, under what terms and in what format, for which purposes. And finally, and perhaps most critically, making sure that everyone who is involved in any way with humanitarian data management understands that protecting the data of people we serve is concomitant to protecting them. And so we need to make sure that there is clarity and an understanding of the principled approach in the operational guidance, but also what's at stake if we get this wrong. I know, Nina, that a lot of REACH's work beyond the direct data management now also touches on this question in a slightly different way. Through assessment and analysis working groups in different countries, you have a platform to promote sort of collective action, again, in data management in the sector. So I wanted to ask if you could share a bit sort of what that looks like and how REACH engages with different partners to kind of model better practice in data management through those structures.
Sure. I think the first thing is, again, just designing the process from the start, right? So we use the platform like an assessment analysis working group to launch discussions on any new data collection exercise. And part of that is kind of saying, okay, now we're going to be collecting all this data. What is useful to you, for what purpose, etc. Minimize the kind of volume of data being collected. And then once you have that kind of understanding of what data needs to be collected, trying to establish a shared understanding of the risks associated, if there are any risks, and how that's going to be managed through the process. And I think already from a couple of country-specific examples over the past few years, we can see already some progress in terms of building the shared understanding and how there's like system-wide responsibility in terms of it's not just the responsibility of the data producer, so that as us as REACH, but also as the end users of the data, how is it all going to be managed? And with a lot of support, of course, from OCHA, kind of developing shared data sharing agreement templates and so on and so forth, and kind of having this informal capacity building almost through kind of these discussions from the very beginning. And off the top of my head already, I can think in Iraq, maybe you know that's actually how, like over the years, there has been quite substantial progress made on this. And now there's this really like well-established kind of shared understanding of what everyone's responsibility is, both for the data producers, us, but also the users, the facilitators, and how that needs to be managed throughout the process. So I think, yeah, that's definitely been a key lesson learned, but also a good platform to make everyone on the same page and establish the shared responsibility.
Brilliant, Nina. Thank you so much. It's a good reminder as well that much of this is simply about having a clear discussion, right? Having clear terms and concepts that allow us to be able to speak the same language and understand how to put these different actions for data responsibility into practice, which is indeed, as you mentioned, the ambition of the operational guidance. Given that we are at a forum with lots of more technical colleagues attending, Nafi, I wanted to come back to you and ask, with perhaps a bit of a forward-looking gaze, what are some technical or statistical methods that you as a data scientist already see sort of coming into the humanitarian sector, or expect us to maybe need to start understanding and building capacity to adopt in our own work, for particularly managing sensitive data, but also for data and analysis more broadly in the sector?
Thank you for the question, Stuart. So there are several new technical methods and statistical approaches that can be considered to ensure the safe and ethical use of sensitive data. And we can mention differential privacy. This technique adds noise to the data to protect the privacy of individuals while still allowing for the data to be analyzed. Differential privacy is increasingly being used in data sharing, actually for public health research and as well as census data. There is also another new technique called federated learning, and this is actually machine learning methods to be trained for machine learning models to be trained on data distributed across multiple devices without the need for the data to be shared. So this approach can help to protect the privacy of sensitive data. Overall, these techniques and approaches can help to ensure the responsible management and sharing of sensitive data in the humanitarian sector.
Thanks so much, Nafi. I think it's important for us to keep that kind of dual facing approach to this work, in the sense of keeping an eye to what we've learned as we've spent a lot of this conversation doing, but also keeping an eye forward, not only to emerging challenges, but also to opportunities, both technical and more strategic. And I think, with no other questions in the chat, I'll just go for a final round of very quick interventions in that vein, turning first to Katrine, then Rochelle, and then Rob. And I'm talking a little bit slowly to give you a time to reflect on the question. So essentially, what I'd love for you to do is think ahead to the next World Data Forum, which I believe tentatively is scheduled for late 2024, so about a year and a half from now. And what would you like to be able to say we've achieved as a system, or even more specifically as the Data Responsibility Working Group, in the area of data responsibility? So Katrine, over to you.
Thank you, Stuart. What I would like to see is indeed, coming back to what I've talked about earlier, the mindset and the shared sort of move forward on data responsibility, seeing this indeed as something that is manageable and something that is the responsibility of all of us, and seeing, as we've talked about in this session, that data and all the work we do with data is indeed not confined to a certain group of colleagues, but this is for all of us. So really, that mindset shift, if you like, that data is so essential, and of course our commitment, all of us, and responsibility to manage it in a safe and ethical and effective manner. So that whole recognition in the system that this is for all of us, and this is not something that is completely overwhelming. This is indeed something that is manageable, and we have by now, with the guidance also in place, a system-wide sort of set of principles, actions, and very concrete templates and tools to help us doing that. So that whole shared language around what data responsibility at a conceptual level is all about, but all the way down to concrete shared tools and approaches by which we can advance this whole talk and walk the talk, so to speak.
That's great. And I would love for us to be able to acknowledge that achievement at the next World Data Forum. Rochelle, over to you.
Thanks, Stuart. Yes, I think there are two parts of it. The first one is the principles. For many, many years, the humanitarian community has been talking about principled approaches to data management. And now I think with the IASC Operational Guidance, because of how it was developed and the kind of moral authority that the IASC endorsement represents, we really have a authoritative source of principles that should guide us in our everyday work. And by us, I mean indeed not just us, the data people, but everyone involved in the humanitarian response. And this is a kind of logical conclusion that if we as humanitarians are doing our work from a human rights lens for protection, inclusion, and solution objectives, data responsibility principles should be the glasses that we wear every time we need to make a decision about what we do, what we don't do, and who we do it with. The other aspect, I think, is the key data responsibility actions, which I would hope one day in the near future become a normal part of just how we work. And I don't want to use the term business, but how we do business. We have 3 Ws, 4, 5, 6 Ws, which are a normal thing in all operations. It's automatically done and everyone expects it. So I would hope that in the future, when you come into an operation, you always find a data and information sensitivity classification, which would be as normal as the 3 Ws. And I think this is a reasonable minimum, and it would go a long way in making a data responsibility a reality on the ground.
Brilliant. I'm getting more and more excited about our shared data future. Rob, over to you for a final word.
Thanks, Stuart. It's a good question. Yeah, so 16, 18 months away, I think benchmarks and tangible examples, they're 2 different things. You know, I think Rochelle earlier in the call said that kind of like the early days of the Ukraine response set an opportunity to kind of implement some of this. And I think the work of your colleague Jos at the center and the work about data sensitive classification in Ukraine and why in that particular example, the case, it was so important. I think that was so important. And I think people like to see examples where something's worked. You take an abstract concept or a new concept, but when you actually apply it and you have something tangible, you can say, this is kind of what we mean by that. I think then people kind of buy into it. I don't think there's anyone within, say, the DTM network that can not relate to why the data sensitivity classification work that happened in Ukraine wasn't absolutely necessary at the time. And, you know, how can good examples of that kind of be, you know, kind of like pollinate to other context? Like, is there any other context that would benefit from that, to kind of take in, you know, field level successes and the role that the DRWG is kind of like a global kind of like moderator or kind of facilitator on this. You know, we can understand how this can work there or that can work there, but that only happens through good work that we see in examples, or that can help it. Secondly is kind of benchmarks or standards. Like, I mean, this is a bit of an impossible question to ask. Like, what do we mean by this? Like, is there any reference points that we can say, you know, this is, or no, it's not? So, like, what is data responsibility in this program or in this operation or whatnot? So having maybe some more kind of reference points about that, so we can kind of you know, raise that minimum line. And as Rochelle said, kind of just, you know, they're just as common as these tools are just as common as a 3W, which, you know, if you went to any response right now, you know, then it would be weird not to see a 3W, for example. So kind of what are these kind of tangible benchmarks that we as a community can achieve as well?
Great, Rob, thanks so much. And I think that's a really good place for us to close, sort of ambitioning to have not only that baseline now, but in a year and a half time at the next World Data Forum, really tangible evidence-based examples of what has worked, what progress we've made, and likely, given how quickly this area evolves, what challenges remain and how we can tackle them together. For my part, I would also love to see, as the co-chairs of the DRWG, us playing a slightly sort of back supporting role to a discussion like this, and to have a broader group of participants and organizations represented in this discussion in its next iteration. not least because I think we have so much to learn from how this work is done in different operational settings, but also because increasingly data management is becoming localized, much like humanitarian action. So we really should be continuing to connect with partners like the organizations online and people who in your own networks, if you're in the audience today, think might benefit from connecting to our group or be able to contribute additional thoughts on how to move forward on the safe, ethical, and effective management of data responsibility and humanitarian action. Thanks to everybody in the audience for joining in the room and online, and wishing you all a great rest of the World Data Forum. Many thanks to Nafi, Nina, Katrine, Rochelle, and Rob for your great interventions and for making the time for this discussion today. And we look forward to continuing to collaborate with you all in the weeks and months ahead to move this work forward. Once again, many thanks to the UN World Data Forum organizing team and the host country team. We are grateful for this opportunity to have this discussion, and we look forward to connecting you at the next forum. Take care.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.